And this is where things get extremely interesting when we mix sound and image. It's a short chapter, but it's a terribly important chapter for a few basic concepts. Some of it also has to do with using basic wording. And so I'm going to focus just on that here with this lecture. I want to support that part of this chapter. First, I want to make a kind of an outrageous statement. I remember hearing this many, many decades ago and being kind of challenged by this. But I have since then confirmed that I think this was a really powerful and important thing to have heard early on in my career. And that is that sound is more important or more powerful than picture. Now, we spend a great deal of time with picture, right? Our previous chapters that we've been studying have all mostly been about picture, about light, about framing, and so on, lenses, and so on. And one can spend an enormous amount of time focused on picture. And yet, there's a strong argument for the case that sound is actually more important and it's more powerful. And I want to touch on some of the reasons that that is so. And then talk about a few other things. Sound, remember, is more internal, right? It is more below the radar. Because remember, when we look at picture, picture exists out in space. There's either a projection or a screen that we can actually reach out to and touch. We can adjust the color and so on. And it exists in the room with us, in the space with us. Sound is invisible, and it comes into us through our ears, and it comes together in our imaginations, in our heads. And so first off, sound sneaks in sort of under our radar. It is more like a ghost that invades us. You can point at a picture. The sound you can't point at so easily. That's not a trivial thing. Second of all, sound is very physical. It's much more physical, I propose, than picture. Even though picture is made up of physicality, and physicality in pictures is really important. Physicality in acting and in set design and in location and all that kind of stuff. But sound is really almost pure physicality. Sound is the result of things rubbing, screeching, banging, bopping, humming, buzzing in air, transmitting those vibrations through air. And sound touches us more viscerally, affects us more in a physical way. Also, in the case of dialogue, for example, anytime a person is on screen talking, whether they're acting or presenting to the camera, although there's certainly the use of close-ups, and actors are certainly able to communicate a great deal with their faces, I'd argue that the quality of their voice, of even a non-actor's voice, a person who is just talking to a camera, say in a documentary, reveals more about themselves to other people than their image, their face does. Simply how one word is ended in a sentence can tip off to the viewer whether that person may be lying or not. It's extraordinary how wired we are as humans to hear so much in another person's voice, even if they're a stranger. Actors know this. Actors know that they also need to be quite physical and visual and so on, but their ability to act still relies an enormous amount on their ability to communicate through their voice. Also, sound in a picture, in a movie, can contain, the sound portion can contain stuff that's happening off off camera, out of the frame, sound from the environment, sound from someone off camera, a gun being shot from behind where the camera is, whereas the picture's limited to the frame. So that's also important. Sound is sort of omnipresent. And sound, we know, is used to literally create whole locations and places. The picture may only reveal a shadow on a darkened street, and yet the sound of water dripping, or the sound of cars zooming by, or the sound of police sirens in the background, sound of someone screaming, all of those sounds fill out the location. It also does it really cheaply, you know. It's easy to pull together these kinds of sounds without having to reproduce an entire city, for example. And then there's the special case of music, right? Score music. Everybody's aware of, at one point or another, how much music has driven them to tears or to joy or to silliness, or has just really set the tone for a scene. So music is a special case of sound, super sound, in how it gets into us as human beings and works directly on our hearts. Really an extraordinary thing. So sound is more powerful than picture. It's terribly important to know that from the get-go, so that you will understand how important it is to consider sound. So let me talk about a few of the elements of sound design. This is common terminology that you'll hear. So one element is when people are talking, right? Dialogue, monologue. And that can either be presentational or it can be dramatic, whatever. Another element of sound design is what I would call third-person narration or voiceover. You hear that a lot in the news or in documentaries and so on. Another element is what we call ambience. So ambience are all of those sounds that make up a location, whether those sounds are real or have been created after the fact. Another sound element is sound effects, of which we know a lot about. You know, we've heard about how much sound effects are used in movies and so on, but even in documentaries more and more. And one other is background music, or we could call that score music. Music that is created to manipulate our emotions. I just talked about it in the previous slide. So these are some of the basic elements of sound design. So I want to talk about a distinction that's going to seem pretty abstract and theoretical, but actually is terribly important to get a grasp on. And that is about sound and image combination. And there are two kinds of classifications of sound and image combinations. There are diegetic and non-diegetic. All right. So, and I want to explore these two different sort of classifications of the ways that sound can relate to image. Diegetic sound is can be in sync or doesn't have to be in sync, but it's the best description is to say it's the sound from the story world of the film. And that's either whether this film is a fiction film or the film is a documentary and it's reality based. It's the sound that would come from that world. And if that world is very, even fantastic, and if that world is even very subjective, it's the interior monologue of one of the characters. If it comes from within that film, the world of that film, then we call that diegetic sound. And it's interesting, this isn't just an abstract thing. The viewer deals with that kind of sound differently than the other kind that I'm going to talk about. And it's important to be able to separate these things out. So common diegetic sound, for example, would be dialogue and monologue, ambient sound, and sound effects. Non-diegetic sound is sound that's been added to contrast with or to complement or to comment on the story world of the film. So some examples of non-diegetic sound. And non-diegetic sound tends to be off-screen because it's not connected with the visuals directly in the film, right? And that includes one of the biggest categories is score music. The music swells up at a dramatic moment. Also third-person narrator or voiceover, unless it's a character in the movie whose thoughts we are listening to. That's different. That's not third person, that's second person. Third person would be somebody who is the voiceover in a documentary or whatever. Also titles, by the way, but we're talking about sound. But there are also diegetic and non-diegetic visuals as well in movies, but we're mostly talking about the sound here. So it's important to understand that films, even modest video projects nowadays, are a mix of lots of different kinds of sounds from lots of different sources, diegetic and non-diegetic, in how they relate to the picture. I hope that this kind of gives you a sense of how rich the combination of sound and image it potentially can be, because it's a continually exciting sort of mix for young and old filmmakers alike, and continually represents an area of invention and innovation